During Easter dinner, my daughter-in-law threw a wine glass at me when I refused to let her parents move into my house. "You are being selfish," my son yelled, and she added that I had empty bedrooms. So I smiled, got up, and drove to the emergency room. While bleeding, I texted my lawyer that phase 1 was complete. The police came. If you are watching this story now, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen under my own roof, perpetrated by my own flesh and blood. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to catch my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now. It makes me happy to know who is listening. My name is Harrison. I am a 70-year-old retired real estate magnate living in Greenwich, Connecticut. For decades, I built an empire. I navigated economic crashes, outsmarted competitors, and turned dusty plots of land into towering luxury developments. My wealth was forged through sweat and countless sleepless nights. I provided everything for my son Derek, who is now 35. I bought his cars, funded his startup ventures, and paid off his debts. When he married Monica, a 32-year-old woman who looked at my bank accounts with far more affection than she ever looked at my son, I held my tongue. I welcomed her into my home. I let them live a life most people only see in movies. The problem with giving people everything is that they eventually stop asking and start demanding. They forget the sacrifices behind the luxury and believe they are entitled to the throne you built. That entitlement reached its boiling point on a Sunday afternoon. It was Easter. The dining room of my mansion was immaculate. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the gleam of the crystal chandeliers and the heavy silver cutlery perfectly aligned on the mahogany table. My private chef had prepared a spectacular feast. It should have been a peaceful holiday. Instead, the air in the room was thick with a toxic, suffocating tension. I sat at the head of the table slicing my meat, pretending not to notice the furious glances my son and his wife were exchanging. Monica had been restless all morning. She was wearing a designer dress I had paid for through Derek's allowance, tapping her manicured nails against the expensive wood. Finally, she put down her fork and cleared her throat, wearing that fake, overly sweet smile I had grown to despise. "Harrison," she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Derek and I have been talking. You know, my parents, Richard and Patricia, have been going through a rough patch lately. They were victims of a retirement scam, and they are practically facing homelessness." I chewed my food slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on her. I knew exactly where this was going. I had seen the warning signs for months. The subtle probes, the lingering visits, the way her parents walked through my halls running their hands over the antique art like vultures circling a dying animal. "And what does that have to do with us today, Monica?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but puffed out his chest, trying to look like the man of the house. A house he did not own. "Dad, we think it is only right that they move in here," Derek said, trying to sound authoritative. "Just for a while. We have so much space, and it would be cruel to leave them on the street. You have always been the hero of our family. We know you will help us out." They had rehearsed this. The setup, the emotional blackmail, the appeal to my ego. They expected me to simply nod, write a blank check of hospitality, and surrender my sanctuary to a pair of grifters I barely tolerated. I placed my knife and fork on the porcelain plate. The soft clink echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, folded it neatly, and looked directly into my son's eyes. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Monica blinked, her fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second, before she scrambled to recover her composure. "No," she repeated, letting out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Harrison, maybe you did not hear me clearly. My parents have nowhere to go. They are family. They are your family." "Monica," I replied, my tone freezing over, "and this house is not a refugee camp. I am not opening my doors to people who cannot manage their own lives. You want to help them, you do it on your own dime, in your own home." The mask slipped. Monica's face contorted into an ugly scowl. She looked at Derek, practically demanding that he put me in my place. Derek's face turned red with anger. He slammed his fist down hard on the mahogany table, making the fine china rattle. "You're being selfish," Derek yelled, his voice cracking with entitled rage. "You sit here in this massive mansion all by yourself while people are suffering. You have millions of dollars, and you will not even lift a finger to help my wife." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I have funded your entire existence, Derek. Do not mistake my past generosity for foolishness. The answer is no, and the discussion is over. That was the breaking point. The moment the fragile facade of a loving family shattered completely. Monica shot up from her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. Her eyes were wild, blazing, with a terrifying, unhinged fury. "You have empty bedrooms," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You miserable, greedy old man!" Before I could register her movement, she grabbed her crystal wineglass from the table. In one violent motion, she hurled it directly at my face. There was no time to dodge. The heavy crystal smashed against my forehead with a sickening crunch. The glass shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, raining down onto my lap. Dark red wine splashed across my face, soaking into the collar of my pristine white shirt. A sharp, searing pain erupted above my right eye. For a moment, the dining room fell into an absolute, deathly silence. Derek stood frozen, his mouth wide open, staring at the damage his wife had just done. Monica stood there, panting, her chest heaving, realizing she had crossed a line from which there was no return. They expected me to explode, to scream, to give them a reason to call the police and claim the old man had become dangerous. Instead, I slowly reached up and touched my forehead. My fingers came away slick with warm blood mixed with wine. I looked at the blood, then at Monica, and I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile. The color drained from her face. Derek took a step back, unnerved by my complete lack of rage. I calmly picked up my napkin, pressed it against the gash, turned my back on them, and walked out the front door. I ignored my son Derek calling after me in a panic. I drove straight to the hospital parking lot. Sitting in the quiet cabin of my car, I stared at my bleeding reflection in the rearview mirror. I pulled out my phone and opened a message to Jonathan, my corporate lawyer. "Phase 1 is completely finished," I typed carefully. "Send the police to the house right now." I hit send, closed my eyes, and prepared for war. To understand how we reached this bloody climax on Easter Sunday, I need to take you back exactly 3 months. It was a cold Tuesday morning in January. I was sitting in my private study overlooking the frosted grounds of my Greenwich estate. The fireplace was crackling softly, casting a warm glow across the mahogany bookshelves. I had just poured myself a cup of black coffee when my son Derek walked in unannounced. He did not knock. He simply pushed the heavy oak door open and stood there rubbing the back of his neck. Right away, I noticed something was off. Derek usually carried himself with an inflated sense of confidence, a swagger born from a lifetime of never having to face real consequences. But that morning, his shoulders were slumped. His breathing was shallow and uneven. He paced back and forth across the Persian rug, before finally collapsing into the leather armchair opposite my desk. I asked him what was wrong, keeping my tone neutral. He let out a heavy sigh, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. He claimed he needed to talk to me about business. He said his technology startup was facing an unexpected cash flow crisis. "Market volatility, Dad," he told me, leaning forward with a fabricated look of corporate exhaustion. "The entire sector is taking a hit right now. Investors are pulling back, and our overhead is killing our margins. I need bridge funding to survive the quarter." He tossed around buzzwords like bridge funding and market volatility as if reading from a poorly written business school textbook. I sat back in my chair, steepling my fingers. I asked him how much he needed to keep the lights on. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He asked for an undocumented loan of $5 million from the family trust. He wanted the funds transferred immediately, bypassing the usual legal channels and the oversight committee. He said it was just a temporary fix, a minor injection of liquidity to tide his company over until their next major product launch. $5 million. He said the number so casually, as if he were asking to borrow $20 for lunch. I looked at my son and felt a deep, familiar exhaustion wash over me. I thought about the sheer volume of wealth I had already poured into his life. When he turned 16, I bought him a brand new luxury sports car, which he totaled 6 months later. I bought him another one without a second thought. When he married Monica, I handed them a black credit card tied directly to my personal accounts, telling them to use it for emergencies. They used it to fund extravagant vacations to the Maldives, designer wardrobes, and fine dining at expensive restaurants. I never complained. I just paid the bills month after month. When he decided he wanted to be an entrepreneur, I provided the $8 million in seed capital to launch his software company. I pulled strings, introduced him to my network of wealthy contacts, and practically spoon-fed him a profitable business model. He never had to draft a real business plan or face the grueling rejection of angel investors. I had paved his road with solid gold, hoping it would make him a strong, capable man. Instead, it had bred a profound sense of entitlement. He believed money simply appeared out of thin air whenever he snapped his fingers. As he sat across from me waiting for an answer, I observed his physical demeanor closely. A man who has spent 40 years negotiating high-stakes real estate deals learns how to read people. Derek was sweating. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, despite the room being comfortably cool. His foot tapped frantically against the floorboards, beating a frantic, erratic rhythm. When he spoke, he completely avoided my gaze. He stared at the brass paperweight on my desk, at the books on the shelf, at the roaring fire, anywhere but my eyes. A legitimate businessman asking for a bridge loan presents financial projections, balance sheets, and a clear repayment strategy. They look you in the eye with conviction. Derek presented nothing but hollow excuses and physical panic. He was not a corporate executive navigating a tough market quarter. He looked exactly like a desperate gambler who owed a very dangerous debt. He was hiding something massive, something dark and rotten. I did not call out his lies. I did not demand to see his financial statements or question his sudden desperation. Instead, I maintained a perfectly calm facade. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste, and set the porcelain cup back onto its saucer. I told him that $5 million was a substantial amount of money to move without proper documentation. I said I would have my financial team look into the liquidity of the trust and review the request. I gave him a completely non-committal answer. I told him I would think about it, but I could not make any promises. I needed time to review the current market conditions myself before releasing that kind of capital. The moment those words left my mouth, the panic in Derek mutated into something entirely different. It turned into a raw, aggressive desperation. He shot up from his chair, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He began pacing the room again, his movements jerky and erratic. "Think about it," he demanded, raising his voice. "Dad, I do not have time for you to think about it. I need the money by Friday. If I do not get this funding, the company goes under. We lose everything. Why do you have to make everything so difficult? It is just money. You have more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes." I remained seated, watching his meltdown with cold detachment. I told him that wealth is not built or maintained by writing blind checks to panic-stricken executives. I told him my decision was final. I would review the request, and he would have my answer next week, not a day sooner. Derek glared at me. The mask of the respectful, struggling entrepreneur melted away completely, revealing a hostile, cornered animal. He sneered, muttering something under his breath about my rigid obsession with control. He turned on his heel and stormed out of my study, slamming the heavy oak door so violently that the pictures on the walls rattled. I sat alone in the quiet room, listening to the sound of his car tires screeching down the driveway. He was terrified. A profound, chilling realization settled deep into my bones. My son was not facing a corporate cash flow problem. He was drowning in a crisis of his own making, and he was willing to lie to my face to save himself. That morning, my blind parental trust officially died, replaced by the instinct of a survivor. I knew I had to uncover the absolute exact truth before his destructive secrets could drag me and the family legacy down into the gutter with him. I would not allow his selfish mistakes to ruin my own entire life. Exactly 1 week passed after that revealing encounter in my study. I spent 7 days making discreet inquiries into his finances. I did not mention the loan request again, and neither did Derek. His silence was not a sign of relief. It was the heavy silence of a man who had pivoted to an alternate strategy. I waited for his next move, and I did not have to wait long. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when a packed luxury SUV pulled up my circular driveway. I watched from the window as my daughter-in-law Monica stepped out. She was not alone. From the passenger doors emerged her parents, Richard and Patricia. I had met them a handful of times over the years. They were the kind of people always chasing the next big opportunity, though they possessed neither the work ethic nor the intellect to catch it. They wore expensive clothes that looked a few seasons out of date, projecting an image of wealth that felt incredibly forced. Today, however, they were carrying an alarming number of oversized leather suitcases. I walked downstairs to the grand foyer to intercept them. Before I could even greet them at the door, Richard had already pushed his way inside. He did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. Instead, he stood in the marble foyer, slowly spinning around with his hands on his hips. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling and then ran his hand along the polished banister of the grand staircase. Patricia was right behind him, her eyes darting from the crystal chandelier to the oil paintings. They did not look like visitors arriving for a casual family afternoon. They looked like appraisers inspecting a foreclosed property they were planning to buy at auction. I cleared my throat loudly, forcing them to acknowledge my presence. Monica hurried inside, leaving the front door wide open behind her. She looked frantic, but it was a practiced theatrical kind. Richard finally noticed me and offered a tight, insincere smile. He muttered a quick hello before immediately wandering into the dining room. I followed him, my irritation mounting with every step. I watched as he picked up a silver candlestick, examining the hallmark on the bottom with intense focus. Patricia, meanwhile, had wandered toward the east wing of the house, toward the empty guest suites. I heard her calling out to Monica, remarking about how much natural light the corner room received and how a king-sized bed could easily fit against the far wall. The sheer audacity of their behavior was staggering. They were cataloging my assets. A knot of cold suspicion tightened in my chest. If you are facing a severe personal crisis, you do not walk into someone else's home and start measuring the square footage of their bedrooms. You do not check the authenticity of their silver. You show humility. You show distress. Richard and Patricia showed nothing but pure, unadulterated calculation. I crossed my arms and stood in the doorway of the dining room, watching Richard place the candlestick back on the table. I asked him if he was enjoying the impromptu tour of my residence. He chuckled nervously, stepping away from the table and wiping his hands on his trousers. Before he could formulate a proper excuse, Monica rushed into the room and grabbed my arm. She physically pulled me away from her parents and guided me toward the kitchen, closing the double doors behind us. Once we were alone, her entire demeanor shifted instantly. Her face crumpled and tears welled up in her eyes with an impressive speed. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, letting out a stifled, dramatic sob. I stood completely still, waiting for the performance to unfold. "Harrison," she began, her voice quivering with perfect pitch. "I am so sorry to drop in on you like this without warning, but we did not know where else to turn. It is my parents. They have lost everything." She grabbed a tissue from the counter and dabbed at her eyes, making sure not to smudge her perfect makeup. She launched into an elaborate, convoluted story. According to her, Richard and Patricia had been the victims of a highly sophisticated offshore retirement scam. She claimed that their life savings, their pension funds, and even the equity in their home had been completely wiped out in a matter of days. They were facing imminent eviction, completely ruined and utterly destitute. She grabbed my hands, her grip tight and desperate. "Derek is beside himself with worry," she pleaded, leaning in close. You know how stressed he has been lately with his company. He is carrying so much weight on his shoulders, and now this happened. We simply cannot afford to put them up in a hotel, and our apartment is way too small. You have so much space here, Harrison. You have an entire wing of the house that you never even use. She looked up at me, her tear-filled eyes wide and pleading. Please, she whispered, just for a little while until they can get back on their feet. You have always been so generous to us. You have always been the absolute hero of our family. I need you to be our hero again. I looked down at her hands gripping mine. The manipulation was incredibly transparent. She was using Derek's stress as a weapon, tying her parents' fabricated misery to my son's professional survival. She knew I had refused Derek the loan, and this was their brilliant backup plan. I pulled my hands away gently, taking a deliberate step back. I told her that I was very sorry to hear about her parents' unfortunate financial situation. I kept my voice devoid of any real emotion. I told her they could stay in the East Wing guest suite, but I established a very firm boundary. 2 weeks, I said, maintaining direct eye contact. They have exactly 14 days to sort out their legal issues and find alternative housing arrangements. This is not a permanent solution, Monica. She nodded eagerly, her tears miraculously vanishing as she thanked me profusely. She turned around to run and tell her parents the good news. I stayed in the kitchen for a moment, pouring myself a glass of water. As I walked back out toward the grand foyer, I paused near the hallway mirror. Through the reflection, I could see the front door. Derek had just arrived and was standing on the porch. Monica walked out to meet him. I watched their reflection closely. There were no tears. There was no relief from a grieving daughter. Instead, Monica leaned close to my son, and they exchanged a look. It was a dark, triumphant, incredibly predatory smirk. It was the look of two scavengers who had just managed to pry open the gates of a gold mine. I stayed hidden in the shadows, my blood turning to ice as I realized the truth. The loan request was never about saving his company. The sudden homelessness was nothing but a complete fabrication. They were planting a dangerous Trojan horse inside my home, and the invasion had just begun. The days following their arrival felt like an occupation. My mansion became chaotic. Patricia reorganized the pantries, complaining about my chef's ingredients. Richard treated the library as his smoking room, leaving a scent of cheap cigars in the upholstery. I maintained a composed facade, but every instinct honed over 40 years in real estate was screaming. You learn to spot a parasite before it strikes. I knew they were digging for something. I needed to figure out what. The first piece of evidence arrived in the mail. I prefer receiving physical copies of my monthly financial summaries. I usually pick up the mail myself, but on Thursday morning I found a stack of letters sitting on the foyer table. My bank envelope was near the bottom. The adhesive flap was warped. The paper was creased in a way that only happens when someone uses steam to loosen the glue, then clumsily presses it back together. Someone opened my mail, reviewed my statements, and covered their tracks. I slid the envelope into my pocket and walked directly to my private study, locking the oak door. If they were looking at my statements, they were mapping my liquid assets. I needed to see where they had been wandering. I sat at my desk and pulled up the master control interface for the estate security system. I typed in my password. A red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. Invalid credentials. I retyped it, assuming a mistake. Access denied. A cold chill washed over me. I tried the recovery prompt, finding the primary email had been changed to an account I did not recognize. I was locked out of my own security network. The system had been hijacked. I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle into a focused knot. If I confronted them, they would know I was onto them. They would bury their tracks and pivot. I had to play the game and give Derek exactly what he expected to see. A tired, confused old man losing his grip on the modern world. I unlocked my study door and walked toward the kitchen. Derek was sitting at the island counter, typing rapidly on his laptop. Monica was nearby showing her mother a catalog of patio furniture. I approached Derek, intentionally shuffling my feet. I rubbed my forehead and let out a frustrated sigh. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice soft, "I hate to interrupt your work, but I am having the most frustrating time with my computer. I tried to look at the security cameras to see if the landscapers arrived, but the screen keeps telling me my password is wrong." "Did the provider change something?" Derek stopped typing. He looked up at me. I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, instantly replaced by a smooth, condescending smile. He closed his laptop and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "Oh, right," he said, his tone dripping with fake patience. "I meant to tell you about that, Dad. The security company pushed a massive firmware update to the cloud last night. It completely glitched the network and reset all the local admin credentials. I spent 2 hours on the phone with tech support trying to fix it. I had to set up a temporary network bridge just to keep the alarms active." He spoke with practiced ease, tossing out technical jargon to deliberately confuse me. He was banking on my age. He was banking on the stereotype that a 70-year-old man would nod and surrender in the face of complicated technology. I played the part flawlessly. I let my shoulders droop. I offered a bewildered, apologetic smile and shook my head slowly. "The cloud," I muttered, letting exhaustion color my voice. "I swear, Derek, this modern technology is going to be the death of me. Everything was so much simpler when we just had physical keys and a simple alarm code." "I do not understand half of what you just said. I am sorry for bothering you. I suppose I will leave the security management to you from now on. My brain simply cannot keep up with these updates." Derek relaxed instantly. The tension vanished from his posture. His arrogant smirk returned. "Do not worry about it, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder. "You just focus on enjoying your retirement. I will handle the tech stuff. It is better this way. Less stress for you." Monica chimed in from across the kitchen. "Derek is so good at taking care of these complicated things, Harrison. You are lucky to have him looking out for you." I thanked them profusely and wandered back toward my study, playing the role of the defeated patriarch to the very last second. But the moment I crossed the threshold of my office and heard the door click shut behind me, the confused old man completely vanished. I sat down at my desk and opened a secure, encrypted terminal on my computer. Derek severely underestimated the man who funded his education. When I had the security system installed 5 years ago, I demanded the engineers build a hidden, hardwired backdoor access portal that bypassed the wireless network entirely. It was an ultimate fail-safe, completely off the grid, invisible to anyone who did not know the exact command line sequence. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Within seconds, I bypassed Derek's amateur digital blockade and accessed the deep system logs. I pulled up the access history for the past week. I wanted to see exactly when and where Derek had breached the system. The data populated on my screen, revealing a chilling timeline. He had not just changed the security passwords. He had routed a mirror of my personal network to his own laptop. But it was not the security cameras he was interested in. I traced his digital footprints through the network directories. He spent hours in the night probing the encrypted folders where I kept my most sensitive files. He downloaded my complete investment portfolio. He copied the contact information for my wealth managers. And worst of all, he downloaded an unredacted copy of my estate planning documents. The trust structures, the inheritance allocations, the power of attorney drafts. He had taken it all. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart pounding a slow rhythm against my ribs. He was not looking for a temporary loan to save his startup. He was mapping my entire financial existence. The realization hit me. The sudden arrival of his parents, the lies about his business, the tampering with my mail, and the theft of my estate documents. It was not a series of desperate mistakes. It was a coordinated, methodical reconnaissance mission. They were preparing to dismantle my life. They were looking for the exact legal and financial levers to pull to take everything I had built. I closed the terminal and sat back in the silence of my study. The battle lines were drawn. If my son wanted to play a game of ruthless corporate sabotage inside my own home, I would oblige him. I would not be the victim. I would be the architect of his absolute ruin. The days following my discovery in the study settled into a bizarre, suffocating routine. On the surface, the mansion functioned as it always had. My private chef prepared our meals, the groundskeepers maintained the frost-covered gardens, and the crackling fires kept the winter chill at bay. But beneath that veneer of domestic tranquility, a silent psychological war was being waged. Derek and Monica played the roles of the devoted son and the caring daughter-in-law, with an enthusiasm that would have been laughable if it were not so utterly sinister. Richard and Patricia settled into the East Wing with an alarming sense of permanence, treating my home like a luxury resort. I played my part just as flawlessly. I leaned heavily into the persona they had crafted for me. I became the tired, slightly overwhelmed 70-year-old patriarch who was slowly losing his grasp on the complexities of modern life. It was during this period of manufactured domestic bliss that Monica introduced a new element to our daily routine. It started innocently enough one evening after dinner. I was sitting in the drawing room reading the evening paper when she approached me carrying a silver tray. On it sat a glass of sparkling water and a small porcelain dish holding 3 large, dark capsules. She wore an expression of deep, performative concern. She sat on the edge of the sofa next to me, placing her hand gently over mine. She told me she had been doing a lot of research on cognitive health and longevity. She claimed she noticed I had been looking fatigued lately, mentioning my supposed struggle with the security system as proof that I was overworking my brain. She said she had consulted with a holistic specialist and purchased these premium herbal supplements. According to her, they were designed to boost memory, improve sleep quality, and enhance overall vitality. She insisted that I needed to start taking them every single night to protect my health. I looked at the capsules on the porcelain dish. They were unmarked, opaque, and completely anonymous. Any ordinary man might have been touched by his daughter-in-law going out of her way to care for his well-being. But my mind instantly flashed back to the digital logs I had pulled from my hidden server. Derek had downloaded my power of attorney drafts. Now his wife was trying to introduce an unknown daily chemical substance into my body. The correlation was terrifying. I offered her a warm, appreciative smile and thanked her for her thoughtfulness. I reached out and picked up the capsules. Monica did not move. She sat there, her eyes fixed entirely on my hand, waiting for me to swallow them. She was not going to leave until she saw the pills go down my throat. Over my 4 decades in the real estate business, I had learned a few tricks about misdirection and controlling the visual narrative of a room. I placed the capsules in my mouth and immediately took a large gulp of the sparkling water. But I did not swallow the pills. Using a technique I had mastered long ago to avoid drinking bad liquor at corporate events, I lodged the capsules firmly against the inside of my cheek, sealing them behind my teeth. I swallowed the water loudly, smiled at Monica, and wiped my mouth with a napkin. I told her they tasted a bit chalky, but I appreciated her taking care of an old man. Her face lit up with a satisfied, almost predatory glow. She took the empty glass, wished me a good night, and practically skipped out of the drawing room. The moment she was out of sight, I spat the capsules into my napkin, folded it tightly, and slipped it into my pocket. This charade continued every night for 5 consecutive days. Every evening after dinner, Monica would present the silver tray. Every evening I would perform my sleight of hand, storing the capsules in my cheek, and later hiding them in a locked drawer inside my study. But simply hiding the pills was not enough. To truly sell the deception, I had to manifest the symptoms she was expecting to see. If she was giving me these pills, she was expecting a specific physical or mental reaction. I began to intentionally alter my behavior. During breakfast, I would act slightly disoriented, asking Derek to repeat simple sentences. I would let my sentences trail off into confused silence. I deliberately misplaced my reading glasses and left my newspaper in strange places, like the refrigerator or the coat closet. I walked with a heavier, more sluggish step. I made sure they saw me rubbing my temples, complaining about a persistent mental fog and an overwhelming sense of fatigue. The effect on Derek and Monica was immediate and chilling. They stopped hiding their impatience. When I feigned confusion over a simple business article in the morning paper, Derek would roll his eyes and exchange a knowing glance with his wife. They spoke to me slower, using the condescending tone one might use with a toddler or a very sick patient. They were absolutely thrilled with my rapid decline. Their confidence grew, and with it, their carelessness. On the sixth night, I executed my usual routine. I faked taking the capsules, played the exhausted old man, and retired to my master suite early. I locked my bedroom door, spat the pills into a tissue, and waited. I sat in the darkness of my room, wide awake, listening to the vast, quiet expanse of the mansion. By 2 a.m, the house was completely silent. The central heating hummed softly, and the winter wind brushed against the reinforced glass windows. I dressed in dark, comfortable clothing and quietly unlocked my door. I stepped out into the long, carpeted hallway. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the thick Persian runner. I moved like a ghost through the home I had built, navigating the shadows with practiced ease. I intended to make my way to my study to secure the latest batch of capsules. But as I passed the grand staircase, I noticed a faint flickering light coming from the ground floor. It was spilling out from the kitchen doorway. I paused, pressing my back against the cold plaster wall. I crept down the stairs, taking them one at a time, keeping my weight on the edges of the steps to avoid the floorboards creaking. When I reached the bottom, I carefully edged toward the kitchen. The door was pushed slightly open. Inside, Monica was leaning against the marble island, bathed in the pale blue light of her smartphone screen. She was holding a glass of white wine, talking in a hushed, excited whisper. I held my breath and leaned closer to the gap in the door, straining to catch her words. She was on the phone with her mother, Patricia, who was supposedly sleeping just a few rooms away in the East Wing. "I am telling you, Mom, it is going better than we could have ever hoped," Monica whispered, taking a sip of her wine. "The supplements are working perfectly. He took another dose tonight without asking a single question. He is practically eating out of the palm of my hand." I heard Patricia say something indistinguishable through the phone speaker. Monica let out a soft, cruel laugh. No, you do not need to worry about him noticing." Monica continued, her voice dripping with sheer arrogance. "He is getting so sluggish and confused during the day. This morning he could not even remember where he put his glasses, and he completely lost his train of thought while reading the news." Derek was amazed at how fast he is deteriorating. We thought it would take at least a month to build up in his system, but his age is really working in our favor. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. The cold reality of her words washed over me, confirming my darkest, most terrifying suspicions. "Once we have another week of this documented, Derek is going to call in the family doctor for a private evaluation," Monica whispered, swirling the wine in her glass. "We have already laid the groundwork. We have been telling the doctor for weeks about his sudden memory lapses and his erratic mood swings. With the state he is in right now, the doctor will have no choice but to sign off on a diagnosis of rapid onset cognitive decline. After that, getting the judge to approve the emergency conservatorship signed will be an absolute breeze. We will have total legal control over his estate, the trust funds, and the company before the end of the month." I backed slowly away from the kitchen door, retreating into the thick, protective shadows of the grand foyer. My son had crossed a line far beyond greed or common financial entitlement. This was pure, calculated malice. They intended to systematically erase my mind to fully steal my massive empire. The morning after my midnight discovery in the hallway required the absolute greatest performance of my entire life. I woke up as the pale winter sun began to filter through the heavy drapes of my bedroom. Every muscle in my body felt tense, coiled extremely tight, with the horrifying knowledge of what my own son and his wife were planning. They wanted to erase my mind, strip away my autonomy, and take everything I had spent a lifetime building. But as I stood before the bathroom mirror shaving my face, I forced my features into a mask of tired compliance. I had to be the confused, sluggish old man they firmly believed they were creating. I walked downstairs to the dining room for breakfast. Derek and Monica were already seated, sipping their coffee and chatting quietly. Richard and Patricia were there as well, tearing into the fresh pastries my private chef had prepared. I shuffled into the room, making sure my steps were slightly uneven. I greeted them with a tired, vacant smile, intentionally confusing Patricia's name and calling her Pamela. Monica shot Derek a quick, triumphant glance across the table. She quickly corrected me using that sickeningly sweet, condescending voice she reserved for toddlers and the elderly. I apologized profusely, blaming my poor memory on a terrible night of sleep. I sat down at the head of the table and buttered a piece of toast. I announced that I was heading out to the country club for a mid-morning round of golf with a few old business associates. I mentioned that the fresh air might help clear the persistent fog in my head. Derek eagerly encouraged the idea. He told me it was exactly what I needed, a nice, relaxing day away from the house to take my mind off things. He practically pushed me out the door, helping me into my heavy winter coat and handing me my keys with a wide, supportive smile. I walked out to my car, started the engine, and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway. I waved to Derek as I passed the front gates, watching him wave back, before quickly turning and hurrying back inside the mansion. I merged onto the main road and drove for exactly 10 minutes. I pulled into a small, empty parking lot near a local public park, turned off the powerful engine, and waited silently. I sat in the biting cold. I gave them just enough time to feel completely safe, just enough time to believe the coast was utterly clear and the old fool was miles away on the golf course. Then I started the car and drove back. I did not pull into the main driveway. I drove around to the service entrance at the back of the enormous estate, parking my vehicle completely out of sight behind the tall evergreen hedges. I used my master key to quietly unlock the heavy wooden service door. I stepped inside, moving with the silent, practiced grace of a man who knew every single creak and groan of his own home. The mansion was eerily quiet. The domestic staff had been given the morning off, a convenient detail I am sure Derek and Monica had eagerly anticipated. I walked through the service corridor and slipped into the grand foyer. I could hear the faint sound of the television playing in the East Wing, where Patricia was likely relaxing. I could hear Monica and Derek upstairs, their muffled voices drifting down from the second-floor balcony, but the ground floor was completely deserted. I made my way toward my private study, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. I had left the heavy oak door slightly ajar when I departed, but now it was pushed wide open. A faint metallic clicking sound was echoing from inside the room. It was a rhythmic, deliberate noise followed by the heavy breathing of someone engaged in intense physical concentration. I pressed my back against the wall outside the study, inching my way toward the open doorway. I carefully peered around the decorative doorframe. What I saw in that room instantly extinguished any lingering trace of familial mercy within me. Richard, Monica's father, was standing in the dark corner of my study. He had pushed aside the large seascape painting that usually concealed my wall safe. He was not just looking at it. He was actively trying to break into it. He was wearing thin black leather gloves. In his hands, he held a professional-grade medical stethoscope. The earpieces were securely plugged into his ears, and the round chest piece was pressed flat against the thick steel door of the safe right next to the combination dial. He was slowly, meticulously turning the heavy dial, his eyes closed tightly. He was listening for the faint internal clicks of the tumbler pins falling into place. This was not the desperate act of a man who had suddenly lost his retirement savings in a random scam. This was the practiced, methodical technique of a highly experienced thief. He was trying to crack a high-security biometric safe, completely unaware that the vault strictly required my personal fingerprint to release the final locking mechanism regardless of the correct combination code. I stood in the doorway, watching him work for a full minute. The sheer, absolute audacity of his actions was breathtaking. He had been in my home for less than a week, eating my food, sleeping in my guest wing, and now he was brazenly attempting to rob my private vault in broad daylight. I took a deep breath, instantly slipping back into my helpless persona. I stepped heavily into the doorway, making my shoes scuff loudly against the polished hardwood floor. "Oh my goodness, Richard," I said, pitching my voice to sound incredibly startled and terribly confused. "You truly scared the life out of me. What on earth are you doing back there?" Richard jumped as if struck by pure lightning. He violently ripped the stethoscope from his ears, fumbling wildly with the metal tubes as they tangled awkwardly around his neck. He spun around, his face completely drained of all color. His eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for an excuse. He hastily kicked the painting back over the safe, though it hung crookedly on its golden hinges. "Harrison," he stammered, his voice cracking with sheer unadulterated panic. "I thought you were at the country club. I truly thought you had already left for your golf game." I let out a soft, confused chuckle, tapping my bare forehead. I was halfway to the club when I realized I had completely forgotten my favorite pitching wedge. My memory is just terrible these days, Richard. I had to turn around and come all the way back here. But you still did not answer my question. Why exactly do you have a medical stethoscope pressed against my wall? Richard swallowed hard. He looked down at the medical instrument in his gloved hands, finally realizing how incredibly damning the entire situation appeared. He forced a pathetic, visibly trembling smile onto his sweaty face, attempting to project a sense of casual, total innocence. "I was just looking for a specific book, Harrison," he lied, his voice wavering uncontrollably. "Monica mentioned you had a wonderful first edition copy of a history text she wanted to read. I was just browsing the shelves and I must have accidentally bumped into the painting. The stethoscope is just a silly hobby of mine. I was listening to the internal plumbing of the house. I thought I heard a minor leak in the wall behind the bookshelf. Just an old habit from my former days in construction work. You probably know exactly how it is." It was ridiculous. It was the most absurd, insulting lie I had ever heard in my entire life. He expected me to easily believe that a man in black leather gloves was auscultating my walls for hidden water damage. I let out a loud, hearty laugh, shaking my head, as if I found his explanation incredibly charming. "Oh, Richard, that is very diligent of you," I said, smiling warmly. "But you definitely do not need to worry about the plumbing. I have a specialized team of trusted contractors who handle the estate maintenance. Please make yourself at home. The history books are there." Richard let out a shuddering breath of relief, grabbed a random book, and scurried out of the study. I stood in the center of my office, still wearing my gentle, oblivious smile. But as I turned around toward my desk, my eyes caught movement in the reflection of the glass doors. Derek was standing in the hallway behind me. He had witnessed the entire interaction. I kept my back to him, watching his reflection. Derek was sneering at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. In that solitary moment, the emotional pain of my son's betrayal died instantly. The grieving father vanished. The emotional pain of my son's betrayal had died instantly, replaced by cold, strategic anger. It is time to go to war. I did not turn around to face Derek. I simply adjusted the collar of my jacket, humming a tuneless melody, as if I did not have a single care in the entire world. I walked out of the study, brushing right past him in the hallway, with a cheerful nod. I drove to the country club, not to play golf, but to sit alone in the quiet mahogany-paneled library of the clubhouse. I needed a secure environment, completely free from the suffocating surveillance of my own home. I ordered a black coffee and pulled out my encrypted cellular phone. Derek thought he was a mastermind, a digital genius who could outmaneuver an old man. He had no idea the kind of resources I had at my disposal. When you spend a lifetime building a massive empire, you do not just accumulate wealth. You accumulate a network of highly capable, deeply loyal professionals who operate in the shadows. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Jonathan, my personal attorney, and a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of corporate litigation with me for over 30 years. The second was to Victor. Victor was an independent contractor now, but he had spent 2 decades as a forensic accountant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He specialized in tracking hidden assets, untangling corporate fraud, and dismantling complex financial conspiracies. I told them both that we had an emergency situation requiring absolute discretion. We agreed to meet the following morning at a private suite in a downtown hotel far away from my Greenwich estate. Getting out of the house the next day required another masterful performance. I came down to breakfast complaining of a terrible migraine, attributing it to a bad reaction to my morning coffee. I told Derek and Monica that I had scheduled a last-minute appointment with my optometrist in the city, suggesting that perhaps I needed a new prescription for my reading glasses to help with the headaches. Monica immediately offered to drive me, her eyes lighting up with the prospect of escorting me to another medical professional. I politely declined, insisting that I was perfectly capable of driving myself and that I needed the quiet time in the car to clear my head. I walked with a slight shuffle to the garage, ensuring they saw me fumble with my car keys before pulling away. Once I hit the interstate, my posture straightened. The fog lifted. I drove straight to the designated hotel in the financial district. I took the private service elevator to the penthouse suite, bypassing the main lobby entirely. Jonathan and Victor were already waiting for me. Jonathan looked deeply concerned while Victor maintained the stoic, analytical expression of a man who had seen the worst of human nature. I sat down at the large glass conference table and laid everything out. I told them about Derek's fabricated business crisis, the sudden arrival of his parents, the tampered bank statements, the hijacked security system, and the brazen attempt to crack my wall safe. I watched as Jonathan's face turned pale, his legal mind quickly calculating the massive implications of my son's actions. Victor remained completely silent, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. "I need a complete, impenetrable financial shield," I told Jonathan, leaning forward and resting my hands on the cool glass. "Derek has downloaded my estate planning documents and my power of attorney drafts. He is preparing a legal framework to seize control of my assets by declaring me mentally unfit. We are going to completely pull the rug out from under him." Jonathan nodded, his professional instincts instantly taking over. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of blank legal directives. We spent the next 3 hours completely restructuring my entire financial existence. We established an irrevocable blind trust, a highly complex legal entity that placed 90% of my liquid assets completely out of my direct control, managed exclusively by a board of independent, deeply vetted trustees. Even if Derek miraculously managed to secure a conservatorship through a corrupt judge, he would find absolutely nothing to govern. My bank accounts would show only a modest living allowance. The investment portfolios he had so eagerly downloaded from my server would be legally dissolved, the funds transferred into the impenetrable fortress of the blind trust. I signed document after document authorizing the immediate transfer of tens of millions of dollars. I revoked all previous powers of attorney, replacing them with new ironclad directives that explicitly excluded Derek and Monica from making any medical or financial decisions on my behalf under any circumstances whatsoever. Jonathan promised to have the paperwork filed and sealed by the end of the business day. The trap was set. From a legal standpoint, the vast empire Derek thought he was stealing no longer existed. With the financial defenses fully secured, I turned my attention to Victor. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag were the folded napkins containing the unmarked dark capsules Monica had been so desperately trying to feed me every single night. I slid the bag across the glass table. Victor picked it up, holding it up to the light to examine the anonymous pills. I explained Monica's sudden, overwhelming interest in my cognitive health. I described her nightly routine with the silver tray, the sparkling water, and her intense vigilance to ensure I swallowed them. I told Victor about the conversation I had overheard in the middle of the night, how she had gleefully bragged to her mother that the supplements were making me sluggish and confused perfectly, paving the way for a rapid-onset dementia diagnosis. Victor's eyes narrowed. The forensic accountant instantly transformed into the seasoned federal investigator. He did not need me to spell out the implications. "This is not just a financial crime anymore," Harrison Victor said, his voice deadly serious. "If she is administering a controlled substance without your knowledge or consent to intentionally incapacitate you, We are moving into the territory of aggravated assault and attempted poisoning. I need to know exactly what is inside these capsules. I told Victor to take them to the best private toxicology laboratory in the city. I authorized him to spend whatever it took to rush the analysis. I needed a complete chemical breakdown within 48 hours. Victor nodded, securing the plastic bag inside a hard case. He promised to have the results back to me before the weekend. I left the hotel suite feeling a profound sense of dark purpose. I drove back to Greenwich, stepping back into the role of the declining patriarch the moment I walked through the front doors. I continued the nightly charade with Monica feigning compliance while secretly securing the pills. I continued to act confused and lethargic, fueling their arrogance. Exactly 2 days later, while I was taking a slow, solitary walk through the frozen gardens, my encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Victor. He did not bother with pleasantries. He got straight to the point. The lab results were back, and the truth was far more horrifying than I had even imagined. The capsules were not some harmless counterfeit herbal supplement. The toxicologist had identified a highly potent, heavily concentrated cocktail of unregulated chemical sedatives. The primary ingredient was a powerful tranquilizer, often used in severe psychiatric cases to chemically subdue aggressive patients. It was mixed with a synthetic muscle relaxant that would cause profound physical lethargy, slurred speech, and severe memory fragmentation. Victor's voice was tight with anger as he read the chemical breakdown. "Harrison," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words settle, "if a man of your age had actually been swallowing this dosage every night, you would have completely lost basic motor functions within a week. In 2 weeks, the neurological suppression would have been so severe that any examining physician would have immediately diagnosed you with advanced irreversible dementia. Monica was not just trying to make you look foolish. She was actively, methodically poisoning your brain to legally erase your existence." I stood completely still in the middle of the cold garden, feeling the biting winter wind against my face. The sheer monstrous reality of their plot settled deep into my bones. My own son, the boy I had raised and given the entire world, was actively participating in a plot to chemically lobotomize me. He was perfectly willing to destroy my mind just to gain access to my bank accounts. The final shred of my parental hesitation evaporated into the freezing air. The heavy winter gloves were now completely taken off. They now wanted to play a ruthless game of total destruction. I was going to show them exactly what true destruction looked like. I walked back inside the house, the frost melting from my shoes, my mind operating with a terrifying new clarity. I had the chemical proof. I had the digital logs. But to execute the final blow, I needed undeniable, admissible evidence of their active conspiracy. I needed to catch them speaking their darkest intentions out loud, without the protective veil of my presence. The following morning at breakfast, I initiated the next phase of the strategy. I sat at the head of the table, clutching a cup of coffee with trembling hands. I looked at Derek and Monica, allowing my voice to waver just enough to sound vulnerable. I told them the headaches and the mental fog were becoming entirely too overwhelming. I said my doctor had recommended a few days of absolute uninterrupted peace and quiet. I announced that I had booked a solitary weekend fishing trip at a secluded cabin upstate, leaving on Friday morning and returning late Sunday evening. The reaction was instantaneous. Derek practically choked on his eggs, masking his surprise with a wide, supportive smile. Monica clapped her hands together, gushing about how wonderful the fresh air would be for my system. Richard and Patricia, sitting further down the table, exchanged a look of barely contained glee. They saw 3 entire days with a completely empty mansion. 3 days to roam free, measure the drapes, and solidify their hostile takeover. I thanked them for their understanding, finished my coffee, and retreated to my room to pack. When Friday morning arrived, I loaded my fishing gear into the back of my luxury SUV. Monica stood on the front porch, wrapping her arms around her own shoulders against the morning chill, waving enthusiastically as I pulled down the long driveway. I did not drive to a secluded cabin upstate. I drove exactly 4 miles into town and pulled into the parking lot of a cheap, inconspicuous roadside motel. I paid for the room in cash using a fake name, taking the keycard from a bored clerk who did not give me a second glance. The room was incredibly small, smelling faintly of stale smoke and heavy industrial cleaner. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the thin mattress squeaked when I sat down. It was a staggering contrast to the sprawling luxury of my Greenwich estate, but right now it was the perfect command center. I locked the flimsy door, pulled the blackout curtains tightly shut, and opened my laptop on the scratched veneer desk. I sent a single encrypted text message to Victor. The message simply read, "The nest is empty. Proceed." Within 20 minutes, Victor and his specialized team of former federal technicians moved in. They did not break in through a window. I had provided Victor with a cloned master key and the bypassed security codes. They entered my home disguised as a premium HVAC repair crew, driving a generic white utility van. For the next 3 hours, I sat in the dim motel room, watching a blank screen, trusting Victor to do what he did best. His team moved through my mansion with absolute surgical precision. They bypassed the standard security cameras that Derek thought he controlled. Instead, they installed secondary military-grade surveillance equipment. These were not bulky cameras. They were micro-lenses embedded directly into the electrical outlets, the intricate molding of the ceiling fans, and the decorative ventilation grates. They wired high-definition multi-directional microphones into the dining room chandelier, behind the heavy books in my private study, and underneath the vast marble island in the kitchen. They created a completely independent closed-loop surveillance network that broadcasted directly to a secure cloud server, completely invisible to Derek's amateur digital sweeps. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my laptop screen flickered to life. A grid of 9 high-definition video feeds populated the monitor, illuminating the dark motel room. The audio kicked in a second later, crisp and perfectly clear. I put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones and leaned forward, staring into the digital window of my own home. It took only minutes for the true nature of my guests to reveal itself. The moment my departure was fully confirmed, the polite facade completely evaporated. I watched on the primary kitchen feed as Monica poured 4 generous glasses of my most expensive vintage champagne. Derek, Richard, and Patricia stood around the marble island, raising their glasses in a celebratory toast. I switched the audio channel to the kitchen microphone, the sound of crystal clinking together, echoing loudly in my ears. Derek was laughing, a deep, relaxed sound I had not heard in years. He leaned against the counter, loosening his collar. "I cannot believe the old fool actually left us the house for the entire weekend," Derek said, taking a large sip. "He is completely losing his mind. I told him he needed a break, and he just nodded and packed his bags." Monica giggled, wrapping her arms around his waist. "It is the supplements," she said proudly. "They are making him so docile. By the time he gets back on Sunday, he will be ready for the doctor to sign the final evaluation. We just need to keep him heavily medicated for 1 more week." I switched the feed to the grand foyer. I watched as Richard and Patricia began hauling massive boxes and additional suitcases through the front door. They were not just packing for an extended vacation. They were moving in. They were actively transferring their entire household into my estate. Patricia directed Richard to carry 3 heavy boxes into the east wing. "This space is going to be perfect for my studio," she announced loudly, walking through the hallway with a tape measure in her hand. "We just need to tear down that awful wallpaper Harrison put up." I switched the camera feed to my private study. Richard walked in, wiping sweat from his forehead. He sat down directly in my leather desk chair, spinning around with a look of immense satisfaction. Derek walked into the study a moment later, holding a thick stack of papers. "Look at this," Derek said, dropping the papers onto my desk. I finally decoded the last of the asset portfolios. The liquid capital is even higher than we projected. But the real gold mine is the physical assets. Richard leaned forward, a greedy smile spreading across his face. He picked up one of the pages. "What about the garage?" Richard asked, his voice hushed with pure anticipation. What about the classic car collection? He has 6 vintage European sports cars sitting in there collecting dust. I have already looked into buyers, Derek replied casually, leaning against the edge of my mahogany desk. The moment the judge signs the conservatorship, the moment we legally commit him to the private psychiatric care facility, those cars are going straight to the auction house. We can liquidate the entire collection in less than a month. Nobody will question a son liquidating assets to cover his father's expensive medical care. It is completely foolproof. I sat in the cheap motel chair staring at the glowing screen as my son calmly discussed selling the vintage cars I had painstakingly restored over 30 years. They were planning to lock me in a psychiatric ward, effectively burying me alive so they could strip the copper wire from the walls of my life. I did not feel any sadness. I did not feel any shock. The chilling reality of their conversation washed over me, cementing my absolute resolve into something significantly harder than steel. I reached out and pressed the primary record button on the interface permanently, saving every single syllable to the highly secure cloud server. I took off the heavy noise-canceling headphones and carefully closed the laptop, plunging the small motel room back into complete darkness. They desperately wanted to tear my life apart piece by piece, arrogantly confident that they held all the winning cards. But they did not know I was constantly watching their every single move. They did not know they had just gladly handed me the final, irrefutable proof I needed to completely destroy them. I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, a slow, incredibly dark smile spreading across my face in the shadows. The gathering phase of my operation was officially complete. It was time to return home and unleash an absolute hell upon them. They wanted a war, and they were going to get one. I would dismantle their lives with the exact same merciless precision they had reserved for me, leaving them with absolutely nothing. The end of their pathetic scheme had finally arrived, and I felt completely ready. The hunter had become the hunted. I stood up, packed my bag, and walked out the door. My total revenge was only just beginning. Now they will pay. I will make sure of that. Every single one of them will pay dearly, I promise. I pulled out of the motel parking lot, leaving the dark room and the undeniable proof of the treachery of my family behind me. The drive back to my Greenwich estate was quiet. The roads were practically deserted on a Sunday evening. I used the time to completely clear my mind. The burning, volatile rage that had consumed me while listening to their sinister conversation needed to be buried deep beneath a layer of pleasant, grandfatherly compliance. I could not afford a single slip of emotion. If Derek or Monica sensed even a fraction of my true awareness, they would instantly alter their strategy. I needed them to remain exactly where they were standing, right over the trap I was about to spring. I pulled through the main iron gates and drove up the long driveway, parking my vehicle near the front entrance. The moment I walked through the heavy double doors, the theatrical performance resumed. Monica practically sprinted out of the kitchen, her face arranged in a mask of overwhelming relief and performative joy. She threw her arms around me, hugging me tightly, asking how my solitary fishing trip had gone and if I was feeling more rested. Derek followed close behind, taking my jacket and offering a warm, perfectly manufactured smile. Even Richard and Patricia emerged from the east wing, nodding politely and asking if the weather upstate had been tolerable. I played my part flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction. I offered a tired but content smile, telling them the crisp air and the profound silence of the cabin had given me a tremendous amount of clarity. I told them I had spent the entire weekend thinking deeply about my life, my legacy, and the future of our family. I walked into the drawing room and slowly settled into my favorite leather armchair. I looked around the room at the 4 people who were actively conspiring to drug me and steal my entire life. I asked them to please sit down. I told them I had reached a very important decision during my time away, and I wanted to share it with them immediately. Derek and Monica exchanged a quick, knowing glance. They probably assumed the chemical sedatives had finally broken my resolve. They likely expected me to announce my early retirement, or perhaps hand over the power of attorney they so desperately craved. Richard and Patricia sat on the adjacent sofa, looking incredibly smug, clearly anticipating a lucrative financial declaration. I folded my hands in my lap, leaning forward slightly to command their full attention. I spoke in a calm, measured voice, projecting the serene wisdom of a man who had finally made peace with his mortality. I told Derek that I loved him. I told him that I had spent my entire life building an empire from absolutely nothing, fighting tooth and nail for every single dollar, with the sole intention of providing him with a life completely free from any hardship. But I continued, my voice taking on a tone of profound regret. I realized this weekend that my endless generosity has been a terrible mistake. I have paved your road with solid gold, Derek. I have shielded you from failure, rescued you from every financial crisis, and handed you an executive lifestyle you never actually earned. And in doing so, I have completely destroyed your ambition. I have made you complacent, entitled, and entirely dependent on my wealth. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The smug confidence was slowly draining from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He opened his mouth to protest, to offer some hollow defense of his struggling software company, but I held up my hand to silence him. I did not let him speak. I have decided to correct my mistake before it is too late, I said, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with my son. I refuse to let my legacy be the reason you never become a self-sufficient man. Therefore, I have instructed my legal team to execute a fundamental restructuring of my estate. Next month, I am officially transferring 80% of my total liquid assets, my investment portfolios, and all of my commercial properties into a charitable foundation dedicated to senior care and medical research. Furthermore, I am donating this entire Greenwich estate to the Historical Society to be used as a public museum and conservation center. The silence that fell over the drawing room was absolute and suffocating. It was as if I had detonated a tactical nuclear weapon right in the center of the coffee table. The shockwave radiated through the room, physically altering the faces of the four conspirators. Derek turned an alarming shade of ash white. His jaw dropped, and he stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. The confident, predatory executive who had been happily discussing auctioning off my vintage car collection just a few hours ago was completely gone. He was replaced by a terrified, cornered child who had just watched his golden parachute violently catch fire. Monica gasped audibly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The performative sweetness she had perfected over the last 3 years vanished entirely. Her eyes darted wildly between me and Derek, searching for some sign that this was a terrible, elaborate joke. But my expression remained stoic and entirely serious. Richard and Patricia were completely paralyzed on the sofa. Patricia clutched a decorative throw pillow tightly to her chest, her knuckles turning white. Richard looked as though he might physically be ill. Their grand vision of living permanently in my luxury guest wing, funded entirely by my stolen millions, had just been obliterated in a single sentence. Dad Derek finally stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You cannot be serious. You are donating the estate. You are giving away 80% of everything. What about the trust? What about my company? What about our future?" I smiled gently, playing the role of the tough but loving patriarch. "Your future is in your own hands now, my boy," I said softly. "You are a smart, capable man. You have a beautiful wife and supportive in-laws to help you. It is time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. The foundation paperwork is currently being finalized by Jonathan. The transfer of the property deed will be completed precisely on the Monday, directly following Easter Sunday. That gives you and Monica, and of course Richard and Patricia, exactly 1 month to find new living arrangements and secure your own financial independence. I know this seems incredibly harsh right now, but I promise you, Derek, this is the absolute best gift I could ever give you." I stood up slowly from my leather armchair, brushed an invisible speck of dust from my trousers, and wished them all a wonderful evening. I walked out of the drawing room, leaving them drowning in a sea of absolute, unmitigated panic. I did not look back, but I could feel their horrified stares burning into my spine as I climbed the grand staircase toward my master suite. Once I was safely locked inside my bedroom, I allowed a cold, satisfied smile to finally break across my face. The bait had been dropped, and the trap was perfectly set. I knew exactly how human psychology worked, especially the psychology of desperate, greedy people. By announcing the impending donation of the estate and setting a hard, unyielding deadline, I had completely destroyed their original timeline. Their initial strategy had been a slow, methodical burn. They wanted to feed me those toxic chemical sedatives night after night, gradually eroding my cognitive functions over the course of several weeks. They wanted to slowly build a documented medical history of my decline, bringing in doctors and specialists to verify my sudden dementia. They needed time to make my incapacitation look completely natural and legally undeniable. But time was the one thing they no longer possessed. They could not afford to wait a month for the heavy tranquilizers to fully destroy my brain. If they waited, the irrevocable blind trust would absorb all my liquid capital, and the historical society would take legal possession of the Greenwich mansion. They would be left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the pathetic remnants of Derek and his failing software startup. I had purposefully backed them into a desperate, terrifying corner. I knew exactly what this forced deadline would do to them. Desperation breeds extreme recklessness. They would be forced to abandon their careful, slow poisoning routine. They would have to escalate their plans immediately. They would have to make a rash, aggressive strike to seize control of the property and my remaining assets before the charitable transfer could be finalized. I anticipated they would attempt to claim immediate squatter rights. They were going to rush, and when people rush, they make massive, fatal mistakes. The stage was finally perfectly set for Easter. The days immediately following my shocking dining room announcement moved with a suffocating, almost electric tension. The atmosphere inside the mansion was so thick with panic that I could practically taste it in the air. Derek and Monica completely abandoned their performative suite routine. They barely spoke to me, darting through the hallways with their phones perpetually pressed against their ears, their voices hushed and frantic. Richard and Patricia no longer lounged in the drawing room, treating my home like a vacation resort. They paced the East Wing like caged animals, terrified that their luxurious free ride was about to abruptly end. I watched them all from the quiet sanctuary of my study, observing their desperate, uncoordinated scrambling with the detached fascination of a scientist examining insects under a microscope. They were rushing exactly as I had predicted. The rapidly looming deadline of Easter Sunday had completely broken their composure entirely. On Thursday morning, just 3 days before the holiday, my encrypted phone vibrated silently in my pocket. It was a brief message from Victor, simply stating that the comprehensive investigation was finally complete. I left the house under the guise of meeting my estate attorneys to finalize the charitable foundation paperwork. A brilliant excuse that caused Monica to physically flinch as I walked out the front door. I drove straight to the same secure downtown hotel suite. When I walked into the room, Victor was already seated at the glass conference table. He did not look triumphant. He looked deeply troubled. Resting ominously in the very center of the large glass table was a thick black leather dossier. I slowly took a seat opposite him, my eyes locked onto the black binder. I asked him if we had enough to permanently bury them. Victor let out a heavy, slow exhale and slid the dossier across the smooth glass surface. He told me that what he found went far beyond simple greed or standard elder abuse. He told me I needed to prepare myself because the truth was a profound abyss. I opened the heavy cover. The first section was dedicated entirely to Richard and Patricia. I flipped through pages of extensive background checks, heavily redacted court documents, and scattered financial records. Victor leaned forward, tapping a thick stack of printed legal filings. The story Monica told you about her parents losing their retirement savings in a sophisticated offshore scam was a complete and absolute fabrication, Victor said, his voice flat and professional. Richard and Patricia were never scammed by anyone. They are the scammers. They are professional, lifelong grifters. They have spent the last 30 years bouncing from state to state, leaving a massive trail of bankruptcies, defaulted loans, and ruined business partners in their wake. They target vulnerable, wealthy individuals, ingratiate themselves, extract whatever capital they can, and vanish before the authorities can build a solid case against them. The offshore scam was just a convenient, untraceable excuse to explain why they arrived at your doorstep completely destitute. They were running from a small army of aggressive creditors in Florida. Your son did not just invite his struggling in-laws into your home. He deliberately imported two highly experienced con artists to help orchestrate the theft of your estate. I stared at the mugshots and civil judgments scattered across the pages. My daughter-in-law was not a concerned child helping her parents. She was an active participant in their lifelong grift, and Derek had willingly brought them across my threshold. But as sickening as that revelation was, Victor quickly made it clear that Richard and Patricia were merely the distracting sideshow. The true horror was buried in the second half of the dossier. I turned the page and my breath caught in my throat. It was a highly detailed forensic audit of my primary holding company, an entity Derek managed with what I believed to be absolute integrity. Highlighted in bright red ink were dozens of unauthorized wire transfers staggered over the past 8 months, funneled through a complex web of anonymous shell corporations. The total amount completely drained from the accounts was exactly $5 million. I looked up at Victor, my mind flashing back to that cold Tuesday morning in January, when Derek had burst into my study, profusely sweating and begging for a $5 million undocumented bridge loan. He had claimed it was to save his technology startup from market volatility. It was a staggering, monumental lie. Victor pointed to the final destination of the laundered funds. Derek did not put a single dime of that money into his software company. Victor explained, his tone growing darker. He dumped the entire $5 million into a highly illegal, completely unregulated offshore cryptocurrency syndicate. He was chasing massive, impossible returns, thinking he could double the money and quietly replace the embezzled funds before the end of the fiscal year. But the cryptocurrency market crashed, and the illegal syndicate collapsed overnight. Derek lost absolutely everything. Every last cent of your $5 million simply evaporated into the digital ether. The betrayal was so immense, so staggering in its scope, that I felt physically ill. My own flesh and blood had robbed me blind, gambling away my hard-earned wealth in a pathetic, arrogant scheme. But the nightmare did not end there. Victor reached out and turned to the very last page of the dossier. It was a collection of intercepted, encrypted text messages and dark web communications. Victor looked me directly in the eye, his expression completely devoid of any comfort. Harrison, the people running that illegal crypto ring were not just amateur digital brokers, he said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. They operate as a digital front for a highly violent international crime syndicate. Derek did not just lose his investment. He leveraged himself completely. To try and recover his initial losses, he borrowed heavily on margin directly from the syndicate. He essentially took out a massive undocumented loan from some of the most dangerous, unforgiving people on the planet. And they are aggressively collecting their debts. He owes them the $5 million plus an exorbitant amount of interest, and they have given him a very strict, immovable deadline to pay them back. The pieces of the puzzle violently slammed into place with terrifying clarity. The sweat on his forehead, the frantic tapping of his foot, the sheer panic when I denied him the trust fund money. Derek was not a stressed corporate executive navigating a tough market. He was a dead man walking. He was drowning in a lethal debt to violent criminals, and his life was legitimately in extreme danger. This realization completely reframed the entire conspiracy. The sudden urgency to declare me mentally unfit was not just an act of pure greed. It was an absolute frantic act of self-preservation. The conservatorship plan, the toxic chemical sedatives, the downloaded estate documents, the eager discussions about quickly liquidating my vintage car collection. It was all a desperate, blood-soaked race against time. Derek needed to seize total legal control of my massive estate because it was the only possible way he could liquidate enough capital to pay off the syndicate and save his own miserable life. He was perfectly willing to heavily drug his own father, lock me away in a secure psychiatric facility, and sell off the entirety of my life's work just to escape the lethal consequences of his own spectacular arrogance. I closed the heavy black cover of the dossier. The silence in the hotel suite was deafening. I had walked into this room as a father looking for proof of a financial betrayal. I was walking out as a man who had just realized his son was perfectly willing to offer him up as a sacrificial lamb to a violent criminal enterprise. The profound depth of Derek's depravity completely extinguished any remaining spark of paternal affection I held in my heart. He had chosen to save himself by destroying me. I placed my hands flat on top of the leather binder. I looked at Victor and Jonathan. I told them that the time for gathering evidence and building defensive walls was officially over. I instructed Jonathan to finalize every single legal maneuver we had discussed. I told Victor to prepare his team for an immediate devastating extraction. I was going back to the mansion to spring the trap. They had planned to strike on Easter Sunday, hoping to use the holiday weekend as a quiet cover to finalize their hostile takeover. I would use that exact same day to unleash an absolute firestorm upon them. I stood up from the table, taking the dossier of ruin with me. I was no longer the confused, vulnerable old man they thought they were manipulating. I was the brilliant architect of their absolute and total destruction, and I was going right back home to sit back and actively watch them all meticulously burn to the absolute ground. I drove back to my Greenwich estate, with the heavy black dossier resting quietly on the passenger seat. The remaining days leading up to Easter Sunday passed in a blur of agonizing psychological tension. I maintained my carefully crafted facade, playing the weary patriarch, but internally I was a tightly coiled spring. Derek and his wife were visibly frantic, driven by pure adrenaline. Richard and Patricia hovered constantly in the background. They were waiting for the precise moment to execute their final strike. I was patiently waiting for them to make their fatal mistake. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by their hushed, urgent whispers. I knew they were finalizing their legal paperwork, confident their toxic sedatives had eroded my mental faculties. They believed they were hunting a wounded animal, entirely unaware they were walking directly into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. Finally, the morning of Easter Sunday arrived. The glorious spring sunshine did absolutely nothing to thaw the freezing atmosphere among us. We exchanged hollow pleasantries over fresh coffee, each of us playing our respective roles in this grand theater. But the true battleground was set for the evening dinner. My private chef had prepared a lavish traditional feast. A towering glazed ham, roasted root vegetables, and a spring salad were plated with absolute perfection. Yet as we gathered in the formal dining room, the exquisite food looked entirely unappetizing. The atmosphere was absolutely suffocating. The air was so thick with unspoken threats, hidden agendas, and desperate greed that it felt physically difficult to draw a full breath. They were ready to spring their trap, and I was fully prepared to watch them burn. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Derek sat to my immediate right, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He had barely touched his food, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors. Monica sat directly across from him, picking at her vegetables with a visibly trembling fork. She kept forcing tight artificial smiles, but her underlying panic was impossible to hide. Richard and Patricia were stationed at the far end of the table, their usual loud chatter completely silenced. They looked like two vultures waiting for the larger predators to make the first kill. The silence stretching over the elegant table was unnatural and deeply unnerving. There was no casual family conversation. There was only the heavy, oppressive weight of their impending ruin pressing down upon the room. I carefully wiped my mouth with a white linen napkin and offered a warm, contented smile to the table. I took a slow sip of my red wine and let my gaze sweep over the four nervous conspirators. I must say I began my voice perfectly steady and echoing clearly in the quiet room. I am incredibly grateful we could all be here together tonight. It is not often we have the entire family assembled under one roof for such a significant holiday. And it is especially meaningful to me, given the monumental changes happening tomorrow morning. Derek instantly stopped cutting his meat. His silver knife scraped harshly against the fine porcelain plate, producing a sharp sound that made Patricia flinch. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with sudden dread. "What changes, Dad?" he asked, his voice tight and strained. I smiled again, leaning back in my chair and letting a note of profound peace enter my tone. "The charitable foundation." "Derek," I said smoothly. "I spoke with Jonathan on Friday before I left for my fishing trip. He assured me that the final legal documents transferring exactly 80% of my total liquid wealth, my offshore investments, and the deed to this very estate will be fully executed and permanently sealed first thing tomorrow morning. By noon on Monday, the vast majority of my legacy will officially belong to the charities completely out of my hands. It is a wonderfully freeing sensation to finally let go of all that immense financial burden and do something truly good for the world." I beamed at him, projecting the absolute picture of a man who had found spiritual enlightenment in his final years. The reaction was instantaneous, violent, and utterly explosive. The sheer terrifying panic that had been simmering beneath the surface all weekend completely boiled over. Monica dropped her fork entirely, the heavy silver clattering loudly against her plate. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying up to grip her own hair. Richard and Patricia froze, completely staring at me, with their mouths hanging open, as if I had just pronounced their absolute death sentences. The luxurious, permanent vacation they had envisioned vanished before their eyes. But Derek was the one who completely unraveled. He slammed both of his hands down on the table with massive force, the crystal wineglasses rattling dangerously. He violently pushed his chair back and stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry, mottled crimson. "You cannot do this," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high walls as he pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my face. "You are making a massive, catastrophic mistake. You are not thinking clearly, Dad. You are throwing away our entire future, our entire family legacy on a sudden, ridiculous whim." I looked up at him, maintaining my calm, seated posture. "My mind has never been clearer, Derek." I countered, my voice soft but carrying absolute authority. "I am doing this to save your future, not to destroy it. You need to learn how to survive on your own merits." Monica suddenly sprang from her chair, rushing around the long table to stand closely beside her husband. She placed a frantic, grasping hand on his arm, but her eyes were locked onto me with a fierce, terrified glare. "Harrison, please listen to us," she pleaded, her voice rising in a hysterical pitch. "You have been so incredibly confused lately. You have been forgetting simple things, wandering around the house at night, struggling with basic tasks. The stress of managing this massive estate is clearly causing a rapid, severe cognitive decline. We just want to help you. We want to protect you from making a terrible, irreversible mistake that you will ultimately regret." Derek reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded legal document and slammed it down onto the table right in front of my dinner plate. It was exactly the desperate, aggressive strike that Victor and Jonathan had meticulously predicted. Derek leaned over the table, his face mere inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. "This is a temporary power of attorney," Derek demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening growl. "It transfers immediate temporary control of your primary holding company and this physical estate to me. It is just a precautionary measure, Dad. Just until we can get you properly evaluated by a specialist and get your health back on track. You need to sign this document right now to protect the family assets from being recklessly given away while you are clearly not in your right mind." They had finally cornered me. They were aggressively using the very neurological symptoms they had actively tried to induce with their toxic chemical sedatives as the ultimate justification for their legal coup. Richard and Patricia stood up from the far end of the table, slowly moving closer, silently forming a physical barrier around the dining room to prevent any escape. They were actively trying to intimidate me, trying to force an old declining man into surrendering his entire life's work through sheer psychological terror. I looked down at the crisp legal document resting heavily on the stained white tablecloth. I read the bold black letters explicitly declaring Derek as my sole legal proxy. I let out a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch for several agonizing seconds. Then the tired, confused, vulnerable patriarch completely vanished from my face. I sat up perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders, and looked directly into my son's desperate, terrified eyes. I let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the suffocating tension of the dining room like a serrated blade. It was a cold, cruel sound, entirely devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. The laughter echoed loudly off the vaulted ceiling, causing Monica to take a sudden, fearful step backward. "You actually want me to sign away my empire, to protect the family assets," I said, my voice dripping with absolute, unadulterated contempt. I picked up the document and held it tightly in the air, letting Derek finally see the cold, calculating strategist he foolishly underestimated. "You have never protected a single thing in your miserable life," I stated firmly, my words striking him like physical blows. "You have not earned a single dime of my money, and you are getting absolutely nothing from me ever." The silence that followed my declaration was heavier than lead. Derek stood frozen, his hand hovering over the fraudulent legal document. The blood had drained from his face, leaving a terrified mask. He had banked his entire survival against a violent criminal syndicate on my supposed cognitive decline. He expected a confused old man to meekly sign away his fortune. Instead, he was staring at an apex predator who had effortlessly dismantled his trap. The power dynamics shifted violently. Derek swallowed hard in the quiet, his mind too paralyzed to formulate a coherent thought. He looked at his trembling hands, completely stripped of his arrogant corporate persona. Monica broke the stillness. Her rapid breathing echoed loudly across the dining room. The facade of the caring daughter-in-law shattered, replaced by the raw desperation of a cornered animal. She realized the methodical poisoning routine had failed, and the vast fortune she had mentally spent was rapidly evaporating. She stepped away from Derek and moved toward the head of the table, her posture aggressive and her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "If you will not sign the power of attorney, we need to discuss a permanent arrangement regarding this property," Monica demanded, her tone shifting to harshly authoritarian. "My parents have given up their lives down south to come help care for you. They have sacrificed their comfort for your declining health. It is only fair they legally establish permanent residency in this mansion starting tonight. They need the East Wing, and we need their names officially added to the estate registry to ensure they are protected." I looked past Monica to Richard and Patricia near the doors. They were no longer the confident guests lounging in my drawing room. They looked like desperate criminals ready to barricade themselves inside. Monica was trying to force a physical occupation. She knew if her parents established documented residency, evicting them would require a complicated legal process. It was a classic squatter strategy, a final play to maintain a grip on my assets, while they scrambled to steal my wealth before the trust locked them out forever. I picked up my napkin, folded it deliberately, and placed it beside my plate. I looked up at Monica with icy disdain. "I am going to make this clear," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Richard and Patricia are not establishing residency on my property. They are not moving into the East Wing, and they are not being added to any registry. They have until tomorrow morning to pack their belongings and vacate permanently." Monica gasped, her eyes widening in shock. "You cannot do that," she screamed, her voice cracking. "They are family. They have nowhere else to go. They are destitute." "That is an unfortunate situation for them," I replied coldly, leaning back. "But this house is not a refugee camp. I am fully aware their supposed financial ruin was not the result of a tragic scam. They are not victims. They are professional grifters running from furious creditors, and I will not allow two con artists to set up camp inside my home. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Richard stepped backward, his face flushing red, as his secret was dragged into the light. Patricia let out a pathetic whimper covering her mouth. Monica stared at me paralyzed, realizing the depth of my knowledge went far beyond what they imagined. I knew everything. I knew their past, their methods, and their lies. Derek erupted. The terror of his syndicate debt and the failure of his takeover pushed him over the edge. "You selfish, arrogant old man," Derek screamed, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table. The silverware clattered onto the floor. "You have billions of dollars. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes, and you are throwing it away to random charities just to spite your own flesh and blood. You are leaving your only son with absolutely nothing while you play the generous philanthropist to a bunch of strangers who do not even know your name. You chose your own path, Derek," I stated firmly, refusing to raise my voice. "You chose to embezzle $5 million from my holding company. You chose to gamble it away in an illegal cryptocurrency ring. And you chose to borrow heavily from a violent criminal syndicate to cover your losses. You are in debt to dangerous people, and you planned to heavily drug your father and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to liquidate my life savings to save your own skin. I owe you absolutely nothing." The color vanished from Derek's face. The mention of the illegal ring and the syndicate broke him entirely. His legs gave out, and he collapsed into his chair, a broken shell of a man who realized he was completely out of time and out of options. But Monica did not collapse. The destruction of her illusion triggered a violent rage she could no longer contain. She had spent 3 years playing the dutiful wife, feeding me poison every night, plotting in the shadows for the explicit promise of ultimate wealth. And now I was taking it all away with a calm, dismissive wave of my hand. She let out a guttural, furious scream. She reached out blindly and grabbed the heavy crystal wineglass resting near her plate. Without a single moment of hesitation, she hurled it directly at my face with all her strength. The heavy crystal struck me squarely on the left side of my forehead, just above my eyebrow. The glass shattered on impact with a sharp crack, sending a shower of fragments and dark red wine flying across the table and the floor. A sharp pain flared across my face, followed immediately by the warm sensation of blood trailing down my temple and pooling into the corner of my eye. Derek shouted in shock, scrambling backward as the glass exploded. Richard and Patricia froze, their eyes locked in horror at the sudden explosive violence in the dining room. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I did not scream or react to the pain. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, letting the mixture of wine and blood drip down my face and stain my crisp white shirt. The room fell into a deathly silence, broken only by Monica's terrified panting as she realized exactly what she had done. I slowly turned my head. I did not look at Monica. I did not look at my son or the grifters cowering by the door. Instead, I lifted my gaze upward, looking directly into the sparkling crystal array of the large chandelier hanging directly above the center of the dining table. Hidden perfectly within the decorative brass housing of the fixture was one of Victor's military-grade micro-lenses. I stared directly into the invisible camera. I knew Victor and his team were currently monitoring the live feed from a secure location. I knew every single word, every desperate threat, and every violent action had been captured in crisp, undeniable high-definition audio and video. I had exactly what I needed. They had given me the ultimate, irrefutable proof. I had documented evidence of an unprovoked, aggravated assault perpetrated by the very woman who was secretly administering unregulated chemical sedatives into my daily meals. It was the final devastating nail in their collective coffin. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out a clean white linen handkerchief. I calmly pressed it against the bleeding wound on my forehead, feeling the fabric soak through almost instantly. I stood up from the table, my movements slow, deliberate, and completely untroubled by the chaos surrounding me. "You have all made your choices," I said, my voice eerily calm and resonating with absolute finality. "Now you will face the consequences." I turned my back on the four of them, ignoring Monica's hysterical sobbing and Derek's pathetic pleas. I walked out of the formal dining room, my footsteps steady and measured on the hardwood floor. I walked through the grand foyer, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of my own home behind me. I stepped out into the cool, crisp evening air. I walked over to my vehicle, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. Before I started the engine to drive to the local hospital for stitches, I pulled out my encrypted cellular phone. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin of the car. I opened my secure messaging application and selected Jonathan's contact name. My fingers moved swiftly and purposefully across the digital keyboard, typing out a single definitive command. I hit send, watching the small satisfying confirmation checkmark instantly appear on the screen. The glowing text message simply read, "Execute Phase 1. My long, meticulous game of absolute revenge had finally reached its ultimate, highly anticipated conclusion. The trap was now permanently sprung, and they would absolutely not survive the catastrophic fallout. The drive to the local emergency room was remarkably peaceful. The roads were quiet, the night air was completely cool, and the throbbing pain in my forehead was completely overshadowed by the immense satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. I parked in the designated hospital lot and walked into the brightly lit triage center, holding the blood-stained linen handkerchief to my temple. The medical staff rushed to assist me, their faces etched with immediate concern for an elderly man walking in with a visible head wound. A young doctor carefully cleaned the area, removing several tiny shards of shattered crystal from my skin, before applying 9 neat stitches to close the jagged laceration. He asked me repeatedly how the injury had occurred, clearly mandated to report any suspected domestic abuse. I offered him a polite, reassuring smile, stating that I had simply tripped in my dining room and struck my head against a decorative glass centerpiece. I told him there was absolutely no need to worry, as the authorities were already handling the situation at my home. While I sat in the sterile examination room waiting for my discharge paperwork, I pulled out my secure cellular phone and accessed the live feed from the surveillance network. The high-definition cameras in my private study revealed a scene of absolute unhinged desperation. Derek and Monica had completely abandoned any pretense of dignity. They were systematically tearing my office apart. The heavy oak drawers of my desk had been violently pulled out and dumped onto the Persian rug. Books were thrown carelessly from the shelves, their bindings snapping against the hardwood floor. Monica was on her hands and knees, frantically rummaging through a pile of scattered financial folders, her expensive silk Easter dress stained with dust and sweat. Derek was pacing behind the desk, his hands tearing through a stack of legal documents, muttering furiously under his breath. They genuinely believed I had fled the house in terror. They thought the sight of my own blood had finally broken my spirit, sending me running into the night like a frightened coward. They assumed they had a narrow window of opportunity to find the physical deed to the estate, perhaps hoping to forge my signature or completely destroy the charitable foundation documents before Jonathan could file them the following morning. Their greed had completely blinded them to the reality of their situation. They were so focused on securing their stolen wealth that they failed to realize they were effectively digging their own graves on camera. I watched my son aggressively kick a leather wastebasket across the room, cursing my name, cursing his own staggering debt to the criminal syndicate, and cursing the fact that he could not find the master ledger. He looked like a cornered rat, completely devoid of the polished executive persona he had worn for the last 3 years. Monica stood up, wiping a smear of dirt from her cheek, insisting they needed to break into the wall safe immediately. It was a pathetic, frantic display of raw desperation, and I watched it all with a cold, detached sense of absolute vindication. I checked the time on my phone. Jonathan had confirmed receipt of my message exactly 30 minutes ago. He was incredibly efficient, having already coordinated with the local police precinct, leveraging his extensive legal connections and the undeniable video evidence transmitted to his secure server. The trap was no longer just set. The jaws were violently snapping shut. Through the audio feed in the grand foyer, I heard the faint, distant wail of approaching sirens. The sound rapidly amplified, piercing through the quiet isolation of the sprawling estate. On the video feed, Derek and Monica instantly froze in the center of the ruined study. The color completely drained from the face of Monica. Derek dropped a handful of papers, his eyes darting wildly toward the heavy wooden door of the office. They stood completely paralyzed, listening as the screaming sirens abruptly cut off right outside the main entrance, replaced by the heavy, authoritative slamming of multiple car doors. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion did not simply open. They were forcefully breached. The deafening sound of heavy boots pounding against the marble floor of the foyer echoed clearly through the hidden microphones. "Police officers, move! Show me your hands!" A booming voice commanded, shattering the unnatural silence of the house. From the camera positioned in the hallway, I watched as 6 uniformed police officers swarmed into the estate, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Right behind them walked Jonathan, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his face set in a mask of cold, professional fury. He pointed directly toward the open doorway of my study. Derek and Monica stumbled out into the hallway, their hands raised defensively in the air. Monica immediately launched into a frantic, hysterical performance. She burst into violent tears, clutching her chest and crying out to the officers. "Please, officers, you have to help us," Monica sobbed, her voice reaching a shrill, desperate pitch. "The father of my husband is experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. He is confused and suffered a terrible fall in the dining room and ran away into the woods before we could get him proper medical attention. We were just looking for his medical records to give to the paramedics. It is just a terrible, tragic misunderstanding." She looked around the hallway, her wide, innocent eyes pleading for sympathy, playing the role of the traumatized, caring daughter to absolute and utter perfection. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a completely impassive expression, did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. He stood perfectly still, letting her finish her pathetic, fabricated monologue. When she finally paused to catch her breath, he reached down to his tactical belt and pulled out a heavy, ruggedized digital tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and held it up directly in front of the tear-stained face of Monica. "There is no misunderstanding here, madam," the officer stated, his voice flat and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "We have received a direct criminal complaint accompanied by unedited high-definition video surveillance." I watched through the live feed as the bright screen of the tablet illuminated the horrified features of Monica. The officer pressed play. The crisp, clear audio of the dining room confrontation filled the hallway. Every single officer in the room stood silently as the video displayed Monica screaming, grabbing the heavy crystal wine glass and hurling it directly into my face with violent, malicious intent. They watched the glass shatter, and they watched me bleed. Monica stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open in absolute, unmitigated shock. The performative tears instantly dried up, replaced by the terrifying realization that her entire life was completely over. "Madame, turn around and place your hands behind your back," the lead officer commanded, stepping forward and reaching for his steel handcuffs. "You are formally under arrest for the unprovoked, aggravated felony assault of an elderly person as well as suspected domestic abuse." Monica let out a guttural, terrifying scream, violently thrashing her arms as 2 officers grabbed her wrists. She kicked wildly, her expensive silk Easter dress twisting awkwardly around her legs as they forcefully pinned her against the hallway wall. She screamed for Derek to do something, to call a lawyer to fix this impossible nightmare. The sharp, metallic click of the heavy handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. They dragged her toward the front door, her heels dragging against the polished marble floor, her hysterical cries echoing through the massive estate. Derek did not move a single muscle to help his wife. He stood completely frozen against the wall of the study, staring at the floor, with a vacant, hollow expression. The reality of his catastrophic failure had finally broken his mind. He knew the police presence was just the very beginning. The unedited video footage completely validated my claims of an unsafe environment. The irrevocable blind trust was completely secure. The charity donation was moving forward. His access to my wealth was permanently severed, and the violent criminal syndicate he owed $5 million to was still waiting for their money. Jonathan stepped forward, standing directly in front of my disgraced son. Jonathan did not shout. He spoke with the quiet, lethal precision of a man who held all the winning cards. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag and vacate this property," Jonathan told Derek. "If you are found anywhere near this estate or anywhere near your father, you will be immediately arrested for trespassing and harassment." While Jonathan handled my son, 2 officers marched down the corridor toward the east wing. Richard and Patricia locked themselves inside a guest bedroom, desperately attempting to hide. They failed. The police escorted the grifters off my property for trespassing, leaving them completely ruined. The morning sun rose over the city of Greenwich, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete facade of the local police precinct. I had not slept a single wink the previous night, yet I felt a surging electric vitality coursing through my veins. The deep laceration on my forehead throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache beneath the crisp white bandage, a physical reminder of the sheer monstrous reality I had finally exposed. Jonathan and I arrived at the station precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning. We bypassed the bustling public waiting area and were quietly escorted into a private, heavily secured conference room by the precinct captain. We sat at the scarred metal table waiting with the patient, unyielding stillness of apex predators who had successfully cornered their prey. We knew exactly who was coming. Exactly 20 minutes later, the heavy door swung open. Derek walked into the sterile room looking absolutely shattered. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and stained with the chaotic sweat of a man whose entire universe had just collapsed. He had spent the entire night desperately calling every bail bondsman and defense attorney in the tri-state area, trying to secure the release of his imprisoned wife. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep bruised circles that spoke volumes of his paralyzing terror. When he saw me sitting calmly across the table, his initial shock rapidly warped into a pathetic, desperate attempt to reassert his shattered authority. He puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the bandage on my head, and slammed his palms onto the metal table, attempting to intimidate the very man who had just dismantled his entire life. "You think you have won?" Old man Derek sneered, his voice vibrating with a fragile, hollow bravado. "You think a single fabricated domestic incident is going to magically erase my legal rights to the estate? Monica is going to post bail within the hour, and we are marching straight back to Greenwich. You cannot legally lock us out of our own residence. That mansion, along with the primary investment portfolios, is explicitly locked into my direct inheritance trust. I have spoken with my legal counsel this morning, and they assured me that your pathetic, desperate attempt to donate the property is completely void because the trust structure explicitly guarantees my eventual ownership. You cannot just give away my future to a historical society because you are having a sudden emotional temper tantrum." I let him rant, watching the desperate spit fly from his lips as he clung onto a legal fantasy that had completely ceased to exist. I did not raise my voice or offer a single syllable of argument. I simply turned my head slightly and gave Jonathan a silent, subtle nod. Jonathan, who had been sitting with his hands neatly folded over a thick manila folder, slowly opened the cover. He did not display a shred of emotion as he extracted a single, heavily notarized legal document printed on thick, watermarked paper. He slid the crisp page across the scratched metal table, bringing it to a rest exactly 2 inches from the trembling fingertips of my disgraced son. Derek stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake, his eyes darting back and forth between Jonathan and me. "What is this?" Derek demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden suffocating wave of apprehension. "Read it," Jonathan instructed, his tone ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "It is the formal activation of the morality clause commonly referred to within elite estate planning as the bad boy clause, explicitly embedded within the primary framework of your original inheritance trust." Derek physically recoiled, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. I watched the arrogant bluster completely drain from his face, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated horror of absolute ruin. As Jonathan explained, the clause was a standard but highly aggressive protective measure I had insisted upon decades ago. It stipulated that if the primary beneficiary ever committed a felony against the benefactor, engaged in severe moral turpitude, or caused intentional documented physical harm to my person, their entire claim to the trust would be instantaneously and irrevocably voided. "Monica did not just throw a temper tantrum last night, Derek," I said softly, leaning forward so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "She committed a documented, unprovoked, aggravated felony assault against an elderly person. Because you are legally married, and because you were physically present and actively participating in the conspiracy to forcefully strip me of my assets, her violent criminal actions have legally triggered the absolute termination of your inheritance. The trust you are so desperately clinging to no longer recognizes you as a beneficiary. You have been completely, legally excised from my bloodline. The money you thought was yours, the safety net you always relied upon, the millions you needed to pay off your violent criminal syndicate, it is all completely gone." Derek began to hyperventilate. He grabbed the edges of the metal table, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to process the catastrophic magnitude of his failure. "But the house," he stammered, his eyes welling with terrified, pathetic tears. "You cannot evict us today. The courts require a formal eviction notice. We have 30 days. We have squatter rights. We still have the right to physically occupy the premises." Jonathan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He reached back into the manila folder and pulled out a second, equally devastating document. He slid it across the table, placing it directly on top of the triggered morality clause. "You do not have 30 days, Derek," Jonathan stated with lethal precision. "You do not even have 30 seconds. You see, your father never actually intended to donate the Greenwich estate to a historical society. That was simply a highly calculated piece of bait designed to force your hand, and you swallowed it whole. That document is the finalized bill of sale. Exactly 2 weeks ago, while you were busy trying to crack the wall safe and meticulously measuring the drapes for your criminal in-laws, your father quietly and legally sold the entire estate to a highly aggressive, anonymous corporate holding entity. The transaction cleared the federal banking system completely unnoticed. You are no longer residing in your father's home. You are currently trespassing on private corporate property owned by a massive international conglomerate that specializes in immediate, ruthless asset liquidation. The new owners have zero interest in your fabricated squatter rights, and they have already dispatched a private armed security firm to physically secure the perimeter. If you attempt to cross those iron gates ever again, you will not be facing a civil eviction. You will be instantly arrested and charged with criminal trespassing on commercial property. You are officially, completely, and utterly homeless." The finality of the statement struck Derek with the force of a speeding freight train. He slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob that echoed miserably in the sterile conference room. The polished executive, the arrogant heir, the digital mastermind, had all been completely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, ruined shell of a man staring directly into the abyss of his own making. He had absolutely nothing left. No mansion, no inheritance, no wife to scheme with, and a $5 million debt to violent criminals who would inevitably come collecting. I stood up from the metal table, buttoning my suit jacket with smooth, unhurried grace. I looked down at the sobbing, pathetic creature that used to be my son. I felt absolutely no pity, no regret, and no sorrow. He had actively chosen this path of destruction, and I had simply ensured he reached his destination with absolute efficiency. Jonathan gathered the devastating legal documents, sliding them back into his briefcase with a sharp, decisive click. I turned my back on Derek for the very last time and walked out of the police precinct, stepping out into the bright, clear morning sunshine. The heavy, suffocating weight that had burdened my shoulders for months was completely gone. I had protected my legacy, dismantled a vicious conspiracy, and secured my absolute freedom. The war was officially over, and the complete, undeniable victory belonged entirely to me. I walked toward the waiting town car, feeling the warmth of the sun washing over my skin. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could finally breathe freely. The treacherous shadows that had infested my home were permanently eradicated. I had spent decades building an untouchable empire from nothing, sacrificing blood and sweat to secure a pristine future for my lineage. When my own son decided to weaponize my profound generosity against me, he forced my hand. He foolishly believed that age had diminished my formidable intellect, assuming that my silence equated to total ignorance. He never understood that true power does not roar loudly. It waits patiently in the absolute quiet, observing every single weakness before striking with devastating, unparalleled accuracy. I opened the heavy car door and settled inside securely. It was finally completed perfectly. I had finally restored complete balance to my universe. The predators who sought to strip my bones had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and permanently discarded. They wanted to steal my crown, but they completely forgot that the king always defends his formidable throne. The magnitude of his failure completely shattered my son. He collapsed his knees, striking the cold linoleum floor with a sickening thud. He looked up at me, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. His hands reached out, trembling uncontrollably, grasping at the empty air as if searching for a lifeline. The arrogant executive who had planned my psychiatric confinement had completely vanished. In his place was a broken child staring into the abyss of his meticulously crafted destruction. He realized the financial fortress I had constructed was permanently locked against him. His wife was sitting in a holding cell facing violent felony charges. He had nothing left to leverage. "Dad, please!" Derek begged, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch that echoed against the sterile walls. "You do not understand what is happening. You have to help me. I am in terrible, unimaginable danger." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the groveling creature on the floor. I did not offer my hand. I let the suffocating silence stretch for a long moment, forcing him to stew in his terror. "What kind of danger, Derek?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "What kind of danger could possibly justify heavily drugging your own father and attempting to legally steal his life savings?" Derek swallowed, hard tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. He was so terrified that the truth poured out of him in a frantic flood. "I lied to you about my startup," he confessed. "The company failed over a year ago. I was desperate to maintain the lifestyle and keep Monica happy. I embezzled exactly $5 million from your holding company. I thought I could double it quickly in an offshore cryptocurrency market and put the initial capital back before you noticed a discrepancy. But the market crashed, Dad. The entire offshore ring was a massive scam, and I lost absolutely everything. Every single penny evaporated in less than a week." I listened to the pathetic confession without blinking. His negligence perfectly matched the forensic dossier Victor had compiled. But the true source of his paralyzing fear had not yet been articulated. I borrowed on margin to try and win it back. Derek continued, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "I took out a massive loan from the people running the offshore exchange. Dad, they are a highly organized, deeply violent criminal syndicate. They only care about their money. I owe them the $5 million plus an insane amount of accumulated interest. They told me I had exactly 1 month to liquidate my assets and pay them back in full, or they were going to kill me. That is why we needed the conservatorship so quickly. I needed legal control of the estate so I could quietly sell off the car collection to save my own life." You have to write me a check right now. If I walk out without the money, they are going to murder me." He clutched my trousers, sobbing uncontrollably onto my expensive leather shoes. It was the ultimate, horrifying betrayal, fully laid bare. My own flesh and blood had actively chosen to mentally destroy me and steal my legacy solely to cover his catastrophic debts to violent criminals. He valued his miserable survival over the mind and health of the man who had given him the entire world. I looked down at him, feeling a profound emptiness where my fatherly love used to reside. The emotional surgical extraction was completely finalized. I reached down and peeled his desperate, trembling fingers off my trousers, stepping back to create a clear physical boundary between us. "I know about the $5 million, Derek," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal precision that made him instantly freeze. "I know about the offshore cryptocurrency syndicate. I know about your massive debts, and I know exactly who you have been dealing with. I have known everything for days." Derek stared at me, his eyes wide with a combination of sheer shock and unadulterated horror. How he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. "Because while you were busy playing amateur hour with corrupted bank statements and toxic sedatives, I hired a team of former federal forensic investigators to completely dismantle your entire digital footprint," I explained, looking down at him with absolute disdain. "They tracked every stolen dollar. They uncovered every encrypted message you sent to those violent criminals. They compiled a massive, undeniable dossier detailing every aspect of your pathetic embezzlement scheme." A fresh wave of terror washed over his face. "Then you can pay them," Derek pleaded, his voice rising in panic. "You know the danger I am in. You have the capital. You can transfer the funds today and make this entire nightmare go away. You can save my life." I shook my head slowly. "I am not going to pay them a single dime," I stated with absolute finality. "I am not going to fund a violent criminal syndicate to cover the reckless mistakes of a thief. But you do not need to worry about those dangerous people finding you on the streets, Derek. I have already arranged for your immediate protection." Derek frowned genuine confusion, temporarily overriding his panic. "Protection?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied, turning my gaze toward the heavy door of the conference room. "You see, when my investigators completed their dossier on your financial crimes, I did not keep that information to myself. I handed the entire file directly to the authorities. The unedited financial ledgers, the proof of embezzlement, the encrypted dark web communications with a known international crime syndicate. I gave them everything they needed to build an airtight federal case against you." The heavy door of the conference room suddenly swung open. Jonathan stepped aside, allowing 3 stern individuals in crisp dark suits to enter the room. They moved with the quiet, authoritative confidence of seasoned federal agents. The lead agent pulled out a silver badge, flashing it under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Derek," the agent announced, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and direct financial conspiracy with a known international criminal organization. You have the right to remain silent." Derek let out a horrifying, strangled scream. He scrambled backward across the linoleum floor like a frightened animal, wildly shaking his head as the federal agents swiftly descended upon him. They hauled him forcefully to his feet, grabbing his arms and violently twisting them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed through the small room, finalizing the absolute destruction of his life. He looked at me over his shoulder as they began to drag him toward the door. "Dad, please," he screamed, his face completely contorted in pure agony. "You cannot do this. I am your son. You cannot let them take me away." "You ceased being my son the moment you decided my mind was an acceptable price to pay for your survival," I said, my voice as cold as the winter wind. "Enjoy your new accommodations, Derek. I hear federal prison is incredibly secure. Nobody will be able to collect your debts in there." I turned my back on him completely, listening to his desperate, hysterical screams slowly fade away as the agents dragged him down the long corridor. The suffocating weight that had burdened my shoulders was instantly lifted. The war was officially over, and the absolute victory belonged entirely to me. I walked out of the conference room offering Jonathan a firm, respectful handshake for his masterful legal execution. I stepped through the heavy double doors of the police precinct and walked out into the bright morning sunshine. I reached up with a steady hand and touched the small bandage resting above my eyebrow. It was a remarkably small price to pay to successfully extract a malignant tumor from my life. I walked to the waiting luxury town car, settling into the plush leather seat with a deep sigh of profound satisfaction. I instructed the driver to take me directly to the private executive airfield on the outskirts of the city. Within an hour, my sleek private jet was soaring smoothly through the clear blue sky, leaving the deceit, the betrayal, and the ruins of my former family far behind me. I sat in the spacious cabin, looking out the window at the fluffy white clouds. A flight attendant approached softly, handing me a heavy crystal glass filled with aged bourbon. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the fiery liquid warm my chest. The charitable trust was fully operational. The mansion was sold. My legacy was completely protected. The jet banked gracefully toward the east, charting a direct course for the stunning cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. I was finally completely free,